Fidel Castro has stepped down in favor of his brother Raul, but so far, no dramatic change in Cuba, much to the disappointment of Miami's exile community. Powerless to affect the Castro administration on the island, they have great power over Florida and U.S. politics. Where does this small community's supersized influence come from? Miami's Little Havana is the cultural center point for 600,000 Cuban Americans in South Florida. It's a community with a legendary and sometimes decisive impact on American presidential politics. How does one group of people get that much power in America? And with the community inevitably changing, how will that power play out this time around? Those are the questions for this week's Frontline Focus. Here's Monica Villamizar.
When Fidel Castro seized power in Havana, the first waves of Cuban migrants flew to Miami and began to create this place, Little Havana. The Cuban Revolution drove thousands more to American shores, and many have been waiting ever since to see the communist regime overthrown. Fidel may now have retired and his brother Raul has taken his place, but the feeling here is that nothing has really changed.
The only change is the person, the person in power. But it's the same thing. The system is still there. Everything is the same.
For many in this community, the hatred of Fidel that has been there for decades remains as strong as ever.
They talk about Castro, they talk about the embargo. There's mixed feelings about the embargo. About Castro, there are no mixed feelings. They always want to kill him. They always want to make fun of him. You know, they always want to be dead. Then we have the hot sauce, and it's called Burning Hell Fidel. And this is like a conversation piece when you're doing, you know, a barbecue or something like that. We are obsessed about politics because we are outside our country because of politics.
A very strong cultural identity explains why many Cuban Americans come to this street, Calle Ocho, in Little Havana to shop, listen to their own music, and even drink Cuban coffee. This community is thought to be very united when it comes to politics. And this is one of the reasons why their vote is highly courted by politicians and presidential hopefuls. The Café Versalles, one of Little Havana's most famous landmarks and a stronghold for right-wing Cuban Americans, has become a routine stop for political candidates eager to win over this small but well-motivated group of voters. Who are you going to vote for president?
I've seen the majority of the Cubans vote for McCain.
I don't have anything against women. My wife is a woman and an excellent woman. She's the mother of 8 children and 22 grandchildren. But McCain represents manhood. And the way the world is going, we need a man in Washington.
Over 1 million Cuban Americans live in the United States, a majority Republican voting bloc. As an ethnic and ideological group, they have carved out significant influence in Washington.
You want me to expand on it?
Juan Suarez is a businessman who has lobbied for issues important to Cuban Americans. Why do Cubans have so much political power in the United States, being relatively a small minority?
It is a small minority. It's one of the smallest minorities. But we have always been politically motivated. We have been quite active in politics. We have organized lobbies, and we have contributed.
Donations are the second highest in the country, after the Jewish pro-Israel lobby. A key achievement of all the lobbying, an economic embargo that Washington has maintained against Cuba since 1962. But the Cuban influence is not only due to financial contributions. The state of Florida is a swing state with a large number of electoral delegates. The way a few voters behave can have a big impact in a presidential election. Journalist Edmundo Garcia is one of the few dissenting voices in this mostly anti-Castro Cuban American community.
This right wing calls themselves the historical exiles. I rather call them hysterical. They don't have a clue what Cuba is. The place they left no longer exists. 95% of Cubans were born under the revolution. People who came after the 80s left family there, and they have some relationship with Cuba.
Edmundo says most of his audience, which is young and born and bred in America, wants to see a change within the Cuban American community. They want to engage with communist Cuba, not destroy it. Ending the 50-year-old Caribbean Cold War and focusing more on American problems is drawing an increasing number of young Cuban Americans towards the Democratic candidates in the presidential race. In particular, Barack Obama, who says he'll at least talk to Cuba's communist leaders.
My generation is not a Castro-centric generation. We are not as concerned about Fidel Castro. We are more concerned about the liberty of Cuba and the freedom of Cuba. We see Fidel Castro and his little brother as an obstacle, but the most important thing to do is to keep the Cuban people in mind.
But the passions of the past still dominate the air for most in this deeply nostalgic community. Hoy como ayer means today like yesterday. For most of the Cuban American community in Miami, despite recent events in Havana, that's the message they still want Washington to hear.
Here in Miami's Little Havana, with the Bush years coming to a close, changes in the air. I sat down with a couple of prominent members of the Cuban exile community here and got a sense of how things have and haven't changed for them. With us today, Joe Garcia, a former head of the powerful Cuban American National Foundation. He's a newly declared congressional candidate for the Democrats. And Ramon Sanchez, a Cuban exile who despises the government in Havana but says the embargo does not work. It feels like there's a change going on in the Cuban American community. Can you tell me what it feels like to you?
I think in Miami you've got a generational shift. For the first time ever, there are more Cubans that came after 1980 than before. They tend to be younger, they tend to be out more, and so their debate and their discussion is a very different perspective from what, say, my parents or mine who was born in the United States.
Do you see it that way?
I think on top of that, we can add that people are also looking back and saying what has worked and what has not worked. And it is time for change.
The embargo is clearly a broken policy. It's been in place for longer than any other trade embargo on the planet, and it's achieved nothing but misery, essentially, right?
The embargo has afforded Fidel Castro the excuse that everything that fails in Cuba is somebody else's fault. So it has, in a way, helped Fidel Castro maintain himself in the approach that he best likes, which is a conflict between the United States and Cuba.
But this is ironic to me because you guys are pillars of the Cuban American community here. It is the disproportionate influence of your community which has kept this embargo in place in the face of all reason.
But that's not a bad thing. That's the truth is, in a democracy, in a democracy where people have a view, and that view is effectuated by votes, you know, Cubans should have more to say about Cuba.
But they have more power than their numbers would suggest in this country.
No, they have just the right power because they vote. They vote hard, and it's important.
I don't think it has been only the exile community's power that has kept the embargo in force. Remember, historically, the embargo was not put into effect to help the freedom of Cuba. It was put into effect when properties of the United States were confiscated in Cuba by the Cuban regime.
You know, but people outside of North America, many of them see the embargo as simple collective punishment. Israel closes off Gaza because they don't like the government there. They deprive the people there of electricity, of fuel, of food and medicine. That's exactly how many people around the world see the embargo in Cuba. How is it not just collective punishment?
It's very different because in the end, the truth is you can buy all the food, medicine, anything you want anywhere in the world. And you know, Fidel Castro has a great speech where he says, "Ni una aspirina penetra el bloqueo." You know, nobody buys aspirin from the United States in the first place.
So 27% of voters, Hispanic voters in Miami are Democrats. There's some shift going on here. Can you characterize
let me give you an example, and it's 27% are Cuban American. And when you add to that in the last 10 years, Republican Cuban Americans used to be 49%. In the last 10 years, they've gone down to 41%, which is over almost a 20-point loss.
So it's clear to you both that the legendary power of the Cuban exile community is starting to shift towards the Democrats.
But that's good. I think Ramon would agree with it.
It strikes me that the Democrats have the best chance of winning the White House in 8 years, and that this is just opportunism.
And the distinction, by who? By the Cubans? Or
sure.
By, no,
go where the power is. Now you're all Democrats. No, change is in the air.
No. What it's called democracy. And democracy, you get to choose a future. Look, if a Republican doesn't get over 65% of the Cuban vote, he can't win statewide. That's how important Cubans are to the base of the Republican Party.
I read a quote from a former member of the Cuban American National Foundation that said that Miami has its own foreign minister. Miami has its own foreign policy. Is that part of a democracy for a community to determine that much of a foreign policy?
You don't think that the Jewish community has its own views
I
on
do,
Israel?
And I'm not sure that's very good for a democracy either. I mean, the reason I bring that up is because I think internationally it's perceived that there's a double standard around terrorism in this community and in this country. For instance, you have characters like Orlando Bosch, like Luis Posada Carriles, who have been accused of terrorist crimes. What I'm saying is these guys are heroes in this community.
I disagree strongly with those
accused
people.
of terrorism.
But we disagree strongly with those people, and there is a huge amount of people in this community that disagree with them. You know, they do not represent the vast majority of the exile community.
How do you see the situation in 10 years from now?
Well, I think that the nonviolent movement inside of Cuba is going to become a factor that eventually will force the government to undergo reforms, and it will end up with a democratic system.
I think Cuba is ready to move on. They've paid a horrible price, and I think the people in South Florida and the rest of the Cubans around the world want to help them move forward.
Thanks, guys.
Pleasure.